Somewhere on a training field in San Antonio, a recruit is low-crawling through red Texas mud. Rifle across the forearms, a strand of wire 6 inches above the back. Nothing about this exercise involves a rocket, a satellite, or a single inch of altitude above sea level. This recruit isn't training to be a pilot, a mechanic, or an infantryman. They're training to be a guardian, a member of the newest branch of the United States military, and by the end of 7.5 weeks, they'll be expected to help defend a war that's fought 22,000 miles overhead. So how exactly do you forge someone for space by making them sleep in the mud? That question is the whole story, and the answer starts with something almost nobody expected. When the Space Force stood up in December 2019, it didn't get its own boot camp. It didn't even get its own instructors. It got borrowed space in somebody else's. The first Guardians to go through training didn't ship out until October 2020, nearly a year after the branch existed on paper. They arrived at Joint Base San Antonio, Lackland, and fell into the same pipeline the Air Force had been running since 1946, wearing the same uniforms, following the same schedule, taking orders from the same instructors. 7 of them made it all the way through and graduated that December, standing in formation with 407 airmen who'd trained right alongside them. As far as the actual curriculum went, there was almost nothing to tell them apart. One later account put it bluntly: the new Guardians were simply handed a tablet loaded with a few slides about the Space Force and told to study it on their own time. That was the entire space part of Space Force basic training. Everything else, the marching, the rifle range, the inspections, belonged to a training pipeline built for a completely different kind of war. It starts, like it does for every branch, in the middle of the night. Recruits arrive on buses that roll onto Lackland well after midnight, engines still ticking as they cool, and the first thing that happens has nothing to do with orbits or satellites. It's noise. Instructors are on them before their boots hit the pavement, sorting hundreds of disoriented 18 and 19-year-olds into lines, taking their phones, taking their civilian clothes, taking away every small comfort they walked in with. This stretch is sometimes called Zero Week, and it's mostly logistics dressed up as chaos: medical screenings, vaccinations, uniform issue, haircuts that take the last visible trace of who they were 3 hours ago. Nobody sleeps much. Nobody's supposed to. And here's the detail that separates a Guardian from literally every other recruit going through that same processing line. The moment you walk in the door, the branch already treats you differently. And it's a small distinction that says a lot. In the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Air Force, you're a trainee until the day you graduate. Nobody calls you a soldier or an airman until you've earned it. In the Space Force, you're called a Guardian almost from the second you step off that bus, exhausted, disoriented, still smelling like the airport. It's meant to build identity early. It also means a 19-year-old with zero training and a duffel bag full of the wrong-sized boots gets to carry a title that, by every physical measure, they haven't earned yet. That gap between the title and the reality is exactly what the next 7 weeks are built to close. And closing it starts with the body, not the mind. For most of the program, a Guardian's day looks identical to an airman's. Same physical training standards, same rifle qualification on the same M16 platform, the same flinch the first time the recoil hits your shoulder, same drill and ceremony, the same repetitive, humbling process of learning to move as a unit instead of a person, of getting screamed at for being a half-second out of step with 300 strangers. There's no simulator here. No zero-gravity chamber, no cockpit anywhere in sight. Just a track at 5 a.m. when the air is still cool enough to see your breath. A rifle range that smells like hot brass and gun oil, and the same red dirt every branch has trained on for decades. One-line instructors use on Guardians and airmen alike captures the whole first month. No rocket, no cockpit, no zero gravity, just mud, sweat, and a rifle. The daily rhythm doesn't leave much room to think about space either. Lights come on well before dawn, usually around 4:30, and from that second, every minute is accounted for. Meals move by the clock and by the numbers. Recruits file through the chow hall in formation, eat in a matter of minutes because there isn't time for anything else, and get corrected for talking, for slouching, for reaching for the wrong fork before the person next to them has been served. The food is fuel, not comfort, and most recruits describe losing track of what day it is somewhere around week 3, when the wake-up, the meals and the inspections start blurring into one long stretch, broken up only by sleep. On a good night, that's close to 7 hours. On a bad one, especially the week the final field exercise hits, it's closer to 2 or 3, taken in whatever short window discipline allows. Then there's the part nobody puts in a recruiting commercial. Laundry runs on a schedule, and so does folding it, to a standard precise enough that a t-shirt out of alignment by an inch can get an entire dorm bay's footlockers dumped onto the floor for a full room clean at midnight. Recruits learn to shower in under 2 minutes because the schedule simply doesn't allow for more. And by week 4, the whole dorm smells roughly the same, regardless of who's standing in it. A mix of gun oil, sweat, and the same industrial detergent the base buys in bulk. None of that has anything to do with space warfare. It has everything to do with living in close quarters with 60 exhausted strangers. And yet recruits from class after class describe the same strange shift. Somewhere in that misery, a joke starts landing. A bunkmate covers for you during an inspection. And the dorm that felt like a punishment in week 1 starts feeling like the only people on Earth who understand what you're going through. Take Dakota DeRosier, 26 years old, an intelligence analyst who came through this exact pipeline a few years into the program's history. Nothing about his arrival at Lackland separated him from anyone else on the bus. Same gear issued in the same overstuffed duffel. Same disorientation standing in formation at 3 a.m., unsure which line he was even supposed to be in. Same instructors barking the same corrections at recruits who couldn't yet tell their left face from their right. If the Space Force was supposed to feel different from the ground up, that difference certainly wasn't visible on day 1. And it wasn't visible on day 10 either. Where it does start to diverge is in the classroom, and this is where the real weight gets added, not subtracted. On top of the standard physical curriculum, Guardians sit through roughly 35 additional hours that airmen in the next dorm over never touch. Orbital mechanics, satellite constellations, the specific ways adversary nations are already contesting the space domain. The history of a service that's barely 5 years old being written into these recruits in real time because there's no 50-year tradition to hand them yet. No old song, no worn-in mythology. Just a syllabus somebody wrote recently enough that half of it is still being updated. Picture running 4 miles before sunrise, standing for a rifle inspection at noon with sweat still drying under your collar, and then sitting through a lecture on geosynchronous orbit that evening on maybe 5 hours of sleep, fighting to keep your eyes open while an instructor draws satellite paths on a whiteboard. The body is being broken down at the exact same rate as any other branch. The mind is being loaded with material nobody else in the building has to learn, and the two demands never take turns. They stack. That combination, physical exhaustion stacked directly under academic weight, is what makes the next stretch the hardest part of the whole program. Late in training, Guardians go through the same Capstone field exercise every Lackland recruit eventually faces. A multi-day, sleep-deprived stretch of simulated deployed conditions, obstacle courses, and small unit problem solving run on almost no rest. Boots stay wet the entire time. Somewhere around hour 30 without real sleep, simple instructions start taking 3 tries to land. It's built to find out what happens to a person's judgment when their body has nothing left to give, and there's no space element here either. No rocket, no cockpit, no zero gravity, just exhaustion, mud, and a team that still has to function, whether anyone in it feels capable of it or not. This is the stretch where de Rosier separated himself from everyone else in his class. In June 2023, he became the first Guardian trained entirely by Space Force instructors, not borrowed Air Force ones, to be named both the top performer in his class and the top graduate across the entire training squadron, airmen included. Out of hundreds of recruits who'd gone through the exact same field exercise, the exact same lack of sleep, the exact same rifle range, one Guardian came out on top of everybody, wearing a different patch. At his coining ceremony at Joint Base San Antonio, Lackland, he stood in front of the formation and led them in reciting the Airman's Creed. Not a Guardian's Creed, the Air Force's. Because in June 2023, 3.5 years into its existence, the Space Force still didn't have one of its own. It's worth sitting with what these recruits are actually being pointed toward once they graduate, because it makes the mismatch even stranger. Almost none of them are heading toward anything that looks like a launch pad. Most Guardians end up at a console in a windowless operations center, tracking objects in orbit, running satellite communications, or watching for missile launches on the other side of the planet. The war they're training to fight is a war of sensors, software, and split-second detection, fought from folding chairs under fluorescent lights, not from a cockpit or a capsule. And yet the only way the military currently knows how to build the discipline, the composure under pressure, and the ability to function on no sleep that job actually requires is the same 7.5 weeks of mud and rifles it's always used to build every other kind of service member. And that's really the answer to the question this whole video opened with. The way you train someone to defend a war fought in orbit is that you don't. Not in basic training anyway. You take away their sleep, you put a rifle in their hands. You make them low crawl through the same mud that swallowed recruits since before their grandparents were born. You test whether they can still function as a team when every part of their body is screaming at them to quit. None of that has anything to do with space. It has everything to do with proving a person can survive the oldest, most physical demands the military has ever made. Because the theory underneath it is simple. You can teach someone orbital mechanics in a classroom. You cannot teach them, in a classroom, how to keep functioning when they're this tired and this cold and still have a job to do. The space part comes later, across years of technical schools and windowless operations floors. Basic training was never about space at all. It was about proving the body could take it first. The same as every branch that came before this one. The program itself is still catching up to that idea, piece by piece. In 2021, the Space Force finally stood up its own training detachment, the first real step toward instructors who actually wore the uniform they were training people into, instead of borrowing someone else's. By 2024, roughly 10 certified Guardian instructors were running about a quarter of all active duty Guardians through basic training themselves, graduating around 500 new Guardians a year, still on Air Force land, still leaning on an Air Force training pipeline, still borrowing more than they've built from scratch. Leadership has said openly they want something more tailored eventually. At a conference in late 2024, the Space Force's top general talked about figuring out the right scope, the right scale, the right evolution, away from letting the Air Force run the whole program, towards something built entirely around what a Guardian actually needs to know before they ever touch a satellite terminal. Nobody's said when that happens, or what it looks like when it finally does, or whether the mud and the rifle range survive the redesign at all. That last part might be the real question worth sitting with. It would be easy to build a Space Force basic training that skips the low crawl entirely, that trades the obstacle course for more hours in front of a screen, since a console operator arguably needs orbital mechanics far more than they'll ever need a rifle qualification. But every branch that has tried to shortcut the physical suffering has eventually walked it back, because it turns out the exhaustion isn't a relic left over from an older kind of war. It's the only proven way anyone has found to test whether a person can hold it together when everything in them wants to quit. And that skill doesn't become less relevant just because the job happens at a keyboard instead of a trench. So the mud probably isn't going anywhere, no matter how far the mission drifts from the ground. So somewhere out there right now, another recruit is on their belly in the mud at Lackland, wire 6 inches above their back, training for a war that will happen thousands of miles above their head, using a training program built almost start to finish for a war fought entirely on the ground. Maybe that's the real test the Space Force never put in the recruiting ad. Before you're trusted to defend anything up there, you first have to prove in the dirt that you can survive down here. And maybe that's not a flaw in the system at all. Maybe it's the one part of it nobody's ever going to be able to automate.